Diane, that brings me to you. Huge decision that Juan Merchan has to make. Talk about the things that he will be considering, how much weight Alvin Bragg's recommendation might have, the work done by the jury might have, and then, of course, these arguments that we're getting a preview of from Donald Trump's side.
Well, in reading the letter and listening to all of this, I really think Judge Merchan has one real decision to make right now. And that is, as pointed out by Lisa Rubin, whether the 330 motion that has been already filed based on the Supreme Court's decision vis-a-vis presidential immunity and should result in this case being dismissed. That is a sound legal motion. The judge has what he needs to make that decision. Frankly, once he makes that decision, I don't know of any legal precedent or argument that says because someone who is now going to be president was convicted of a crime prior to being president for a crime that occurred before he became president should somehow not have to face the consequences. If Donald Trump were anybody else, and, you know, Judge Merchan, just because the people and the defense have asked him to adjourn this to consider it, he doesn't have to do it. He can do whatever he thinks is right. If he could sentence Mr. Trump to a non-incarceratory sentence, which would essentially be a conditional discharge, go lead a law-abiding life, a $325 mandatory court surcharge, and then Mr. Trump could go to the appellate division and make all the same arguments he's making now. The judge has that option. Whether he will do that in light of the fact that both sides now want an adjournment to talk about this unique position that because he's going to be president in 2 months, he isn't going to be held accountable like any other citizen, he may choose to do that. Those are his options as I see them.
What do you think, so understanding that that's an option, what do you think the likelihood, what would be the compelling reason for him to take what seems to be, given what both sides are talking about, that option?
Well, how about the fact that a jury found this man guilty of 34 felony counts? How about the fact that the judge very strongly during the entire trial said that we're not going to consider the political ramifications of this. We're going to treat him like any other person, presumed innocent, but charged with a crime. But now that cloak of innocence has faded. Look, I think the real issue here is, can you put Mr. Trump in jail at this point in time when he's going to be president? I think the answer to that is clearly no. You cannot do that. That would interfere with his ability to run this country. Will a conditional discharge have anything to do with that? No.
So let me ask you again, part of the conversation that we've been having, right? And Bill Barr talked about this. So let me read you his quote, what he said right after Trump was elected. The American people have rendered their verdict on President Trump and decisively chosen him to lead the country for the next 4 years. They did that with full knowledge of the claims against him by prosecutors around the country. And I think Attorney General Garland and state prosecutors should respect the people's decision and dismiss the cases against President Trump now. We have no precedent for this. We have never had a president-elect who is going into office with criminal convictions and a sentencing hanging over him. Does the judge weigh the verdict, essentially, of American voters against the verdict by the people who sat there and listened to that case for week after week after week?
Well, I'm going to take the position as a former judge that the verdict of American voters has absolutely nothing to do with this. Otherwise, what is our justice system? Are we going to make decisions in the future based on what voters think? I agree with Mr. former Attorney General Barr. You can't put the man in jail now. I agree with that. In that sense, what the voters have said does play into this, obviously. But I don't know that the vote has anything to do with the idea of conviction. Now, having said all this, there is a perfectly reasonable view in which Judge Merchan would say, okay, let this play out, let everybody file their motions, and we'll decide this in the due course. That's a reasonable position, too. But I don't think this sense of we should automatically be dismissing this because the voters voted for this man by, as what Peter says, a 50 point whatever percent margin. Yeah, margin. I find that to be a very disturbing precedent.
So, Lisa, I have almost perfected the art of reading your notes upside down as you continue. Literally, we got printouts of this as we were coming on the air, so you've been going through it. There are options, right? Potentially for 2029.
There are. And I think part of the DA's thinking here is Trump is going to move to dismiss this indictment, whether we support it or not. And they might even go to a court outside Judge Merchan's jurisdiction, either a New York appeals court or even a federal court, and seek a stay of everything that's going on. In light of that, what should we do? And I think they spell that out in the letter to Judge Merchan, saying consideration must be given to various non-dismissal options that may address any concerns raised by the pendency of a post-trial criminal proceeding during the pendency, such as, and here's the key phrase, deferral of all remaining criminal proceedings until after the end of defendant's upcoming presidential term. That's as stark language as you could find in a filing like this. They are saying to Judge Merchan, one of our options is just wait him out. We don't have to dismiss this case. We recognize, as Diane was saying earlier, that sentencing him might be inappropriate now, or you might not want to do that right now. He certainly doesn't want to do that. The one thing Donald Trump wants to do least of all is to have to return to 100 Center Street and sit through a sentencing hearing, even if the end result is time served or a conditional discharge, as Diane was talking about before. And so recognizing that he wants to move to dismiss, he doesn't want to sit for a sentencing. What are your options as the DA to defend the verdict? It's to say, great, go be president and we'll still be here.
Let me have you weigh in on that, Christy. What would, again, using the words in this letter, various non-dismissal options look like?
So I think that there is very little shot that Donald Trump is sentenced before he takes office because, look, if we've learned nothing else from watching Trump and his team, the one thing they are good at is delay. Delay is the name of the game. And they've got 2 months until he takes office. And so even if Judge Merchan were to say, let's go forward with the sentencing date, which is not what either party wants, even if he were to say, let's go do that, they will appeal, and they will appeal, and they will try to run out this clock for the next 2 months. So I just don't see that happening. I think that we are really looking at any sentencing happening after his term is over. And, that may be the best approach as well, because who knows what the world looks like at that point. And, how much do we really accomplish with him being sentenced right now and getting a slap on the wrist? Before the election would have been the time to sentence him. Unfortunately, in a decision that I disagreed with, the DA's office did not oppose Trump's request to delay the sentencing until after the election. We could have had this sentencing when Judge Merchan initially scheduled it before the election, and we wouldn't be talking about this right now. But they didn't do that and are where we are. So I do think that the sentencing, I do think that this case will not be dismissed. I think that there is every valid reason for the jury's verdict to stand. And I do think that we will just be on hold. None of the arguments so far in the letter from the defense attorney cite to any authority saying that this case needs to be dismissed because he was now elected to be president again. There's just no law to support that. So unless new law is created to justify that, I think we will be on hold until he is no longer president.
So, Peter, we talked about potential motivation 2 years ago when he said he would run again for office. But a year ago, Donald Trump was facing 4 criminal cases, the possibility of years behind bars. And now he may, and that's a big may, given the conversation we just had and the possibility of a postponement, but he may walk away or at least avoid prison time. I wonder benefit of history. Is that luck? Is it skill? Is it the value of stalling? Something that Donald Trump has done very successfully in business as well as politics. Is there any clear sense of what we might attribute that to, Peter?
Yeah, look, I think as we've just been talking about, his strategy all along was delay, and he's been very good at that. He's been good at that historically, even before these particular cases. But I think it says something, and I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me for offering this, but it says something about our justice system that 4 years can pass and we have not fully resolved any of these 4 cases. We did not get from beginning to middle to conclusion in any of these cases in 4 years, and 3 of them we didn't even get to a trial. And I think that's, in terms of the issue of justice delayed, in terms of the issue of providing voters with the full account that they could have had before they made their choice, I think that says something about where our stand now. Now, you make the argument that voters did, in fact, know basically what the former president was accused of, and they made their evaluation. Fair enough. 50% of them obviously decided it wasn't important enough to them to vote against him, even with 34 felony convictions. But the fact that we didn't manage to resolve these one way or the other, even if he's innocent or guilty, either way, to say this is the definitive conclusion of our justice system says something about our ability to exercise accountability in the modern age.